problem with talking about Nietzsche is he's famously multivocal and he undermines himself and criticizes himself. But I think
Hello, John Vervaeke.
Hi.
Welcome to How Light Gets In Festival.
Thank you. I'm having a wonderful time.
John is an award-winning professor at the University of Toronto. Various series as well, very popular. A recent one as well.
Yeah, so there's a recent one on cognitive science that I'm doing with Greg Enriquez called Transcendent Naturalism, which is around really trying to bridge between science and spirituality, which I think is important for the larger work that I do, like awakening from the meaning crisis and things like that.
Yeah. Consciousness.
Yes.
Can you tell me why we have consciousness, what is consciousness, and what is it for?
So, I really think that the way you asked those questions was excellent, because one of the problems is we don't properly distinguish the questions from each other. There's one question like, what is consciousness, which is the problem of how does something like consciousness fit into the furniture of the physical universe. And then there's the other question, so let's call that the nature question. And then there's the function question. Well, what does consciousness do? And what's it for? And I think one of the problems that, or one of the criticisms I have about how people have been wrestling with consciousness is they're often trying to answer one of these questions without answering what I think is the third question, which is the meta question. What is actually the relationship between the nature question and the function question? And here I would argue that the two questions should be answered in an integrated fashion.
How should we answer them?
So for me, I try to answer them by getting a clear understanding of what the function of consciousness is, and then argue that if we get a clear explanation of the function of consciousness, we get something that's rich enough to start filling out the phenomenology, and then from the phenomenology we can go on to explain the nature of consciousness. So that's the project.
And what is consciousness's function then in that? Because people can argue that consciousness is kind of just along for the ride, that we could function without it.
Yeah, and so what I think, building on the work of a lot of other people, Bohr and Seth and some important experimental work, consciousness seems to be needed when you're facing ill-defined problems that are highly novel, highly complex, often dynamic in nature, in which issues of timing are really important. And consciousness is therefore also associated with working memory, with how we sort of do our online problem solving. And working memory, measures of working memory correlate very high with measures of general intelligence. And so what I think consciousness is doing is it's taking what I think are the core functions of intelligence, anticipation and relevance realization, and then it's doing a higher order version of them. So it's basically a way of recursively enhancing our intelligence so that we can deal with problems that are noisy, novel, complex, dynamic, timing matters, right, and are relatively ill-defined for us. And it does that in two ways. There's a way in which we get that, the way it makes particular problems like salient to us as episodes in our life, and so it's connected with forming episodic memory. But it also does it in sort of giving us a general orienting stance and grip on the world. So do you know when like in a martial art, when you take a fighting stance and you don't actually use that?
I don't do martial arts personally.
Okay, but the thing about the fighting stance is you take that stance because what it does is it actually sets you up to get optimally into many different actual fighting moves that you need. And so it's like a meta-optimal stance. Does that? I think consciousness is like a meta-optimal stance orienting us in the world, and then we can also focus it for particular episodes and form episodic memory, because episodic memory allows us to solve certain problems that other memories don't.
How is that different to attention? Because that sounds a lot like attention.
Well, and this is the thing, attention, fluid general intelligence, working memory, and consciousness are not readily distinguishable in sort of the areas of the brain in which we most plausibly try and sort of say, like, this is where it's going on. Now, I know there's a lot of problems with looking for a neural correlate of consciousness, but generally, I wouldn't want to reduce any one of those to any of the other ones. I would want to say that there's this like core four, and what we're doing is we're putting different names on different facets of this core thing we pick up with fluid intelligence, attention, working memory, and consciousness.
So it's not a physicalist account of consciousness in your view?
It depends what you mean by physicalist. I mean, so there's reductive physicalism, which says all explanations have to be reducible to sort of your bottom fundamental ontology you found in physics. I think for a whole host of very good philosophical arguments that reductive physicalism is a bankrupt project. For just one quick example, it doesn't give you an ontology at the level at which science is done. It doesn't tell you how scientists and their equipment and their arguments and their theories are real. What it does is say all of that somehow gives us and everything above is an illusion, but then you're in this performative contradiction that you're saying, but the science that tells me the bottom level is not real, but I'm supposed to believe it. And so I think you have to break out of a reductive physicalism. So I don't use the word physicalism precisely because it has been pretty much associated with a reductive physicalism. I use the term naturalism instead.
And so what does naturalism mean to you? Is consciousness created by the brain? What is it?
Deeply influenced by Alicia Urero's work, and the idea that a tree, you have causation, and there's all these events, and it causes a structure, right? But the tree grows the way it does because that alters not causal events, it alters the possibility space. So it makes it more probable that a photon will interact with a chlorophyll molecule. And so you've got causation up, and then you have constraints down. You have actuality up and real possibility down. And so what naturalism is saying is that, well, is it created by, it emerges from the brain, but it also emanates from how the brain is embedded in its environment and larger context.
You're also a very spiritual person.
I guess so, yeah.
I have you quoted as saying, actually, don't tell me what you believe, tell me what you practice.
Yes, I still hold that, yeah.
What do you mean by that, and why are practices so important? And what do we mean by practice, sorry, so what are we talking?
So I think rituals are collective practices, and practices are individual rituals. So I don't just mean like practicing something, like repeating it just to get better. I mean that you're doing this in order to try and afford a transformation in the practice that transfers broadly and deeply to many domains of your life. That's what I mean by a practice. And so what I'm arguing is that when people are seeking that kind of transformation of their life, they're not primarily engaging just with the propositional knowing that gives us belief. They're also relying on the cultivation of skills that gives them a procedural ability. They're relying on the kind of perspectives that they can generate with consciousness, so they have the episodic memory of what's it like to be me in this situation, in this state of mind. And they're also ultimately relying on that sort of participatory knowing. How is my identity changing in a way that's coordinating how the identity of things for me in the world is changing? And how are they bound together so that I properly, that me is an agent and the world is an arena, how we fit together. And so belief is up here, believing that, but what people are ultimately seeking are skills, and they're seeking sensibilities, perspectives, and they're seeking traits of character. They're seeking virtue, which integrates all of them together. And so telling me what you believe doesn't tell me how you're going to be virtuous. This is why being a great moral philosopher and being able to rattle off arguments in moral philosophy is not predictive of being a moral person.
Yeah, it reminds me of kind of, you're trying to think your way out of a problem, you can just go in circles forever.
Yes.
But unless you have a practice, you're not going to change yourself, and you're not going to...
Because a lot of problems are not solved just by sort of using a method of obtaining more information. They require a fundamental transformation in all of those levels in order for the world to be disclosable to us in the way we need in order to solve certain kinds of problems.
So I believe you meditate, Vipassana, and do Tai Chi, is this true?
Oh, I do a lot of practices. I do Vipassana meditation, I do a Neoplatonic contemplation practice, I do Tai Chi Chuan, I Chuan, Jen, Zheng. These are all, I'm learning Jeet Kune Do. I do a Lectio Divina practice. I do dialogical practices.
And
yes.
how does your kind of naturalism fit in with that more kind of mystical, spiritual? I mean, those practices are usually in a spiritual context.
Yes, and so what I've been arguing for is what I call extended naturalism. So standard naturalism is that naturalism is just what is derivable from our natural sciences, and so my ontology is whatever I can derive from physics and chemistry and biology. Extended naturalism says no, it's not just what is derivable from the natural sciences, what is presupposed by the natural sciences. Like when we were talking about this a few minutes ago, but like one of the things that's presupposed by all the natural sciences is the intelligibility of the world. And so what do you need to get a philosophical framework about what is intelligibility, how does it relate to being, and a long argument that I can't do right now is, but it lines up with what I was saying about emergence and emanation. You get a leveled ontology, and you also get, right, in that extended naturalism, you also get this idea that when we're knowing things, we're not just representing them, we're coupling to them and conforming to them. And then what that affords is you can realize strong transcendence, which I think is the core thing that people are after in spirituality. They don't want transcendence to just be a psychological event. They want it to something that has epistemological import and ontological import. It's a kind of knowing, and it's a kind of disclosure about what's real, so that they are in contact with what is most real. And so I think extended naturalism affords strong transcendence, and then that gives you an understanding of why mystical experiences can be important to people. Sorry, but that was
yeah. I mean, mystical experiences are obviously, I mean, they're in a culture increasingly due to kind of psychedelics becoming legalized, and people are becoming, I mean, their mental health issues are often getting better, sometimes getting worse. But is a naturalist account of mystical experience viable?
I think it's not only viable, I would recommend it, because I think what a naturalistic account of mystical experiences does is to get you to try to be very clear of how the phenomenology plugs into the function. And I think what we've tended to do is we've overemphasized the phenomenology, right, and then leapt into a metaphysics, which is a very problematic move. If you concentrate on how the phenomenology grounds, like I was doing with consciousness, what is this doing? What is its function? Then you can say, well, the point of mystical experience isn't to get arcane knowledge and mysterious metaphysics that just is somehow orthogonal or contradicts science. The point of mystical experience is to bring about those fundamental transformations that cultivate wisdom. And whereas knowledge is about overcoming ignorance, wisdom is about overcoming self-deception and foolishness.
How is this different to a kind of correspondence theory of truth, though, which I think has kind of been left behind now? The idea that we kind of see the world, and truth is how our ideas about the world correspond with reality. I think the idea that we can know reality is kind of dying at the moment.
Well, I think if you think that the correspondence truth is the way in which knowing should be understood, the problem with that correspondence theory is it presupposes that, I don't know how to put it, reality is divided into the subjective and objective and that's exhaustive. So there is nothing that properly exists in your ontology to relate the subjective and objective together, and therefore truth is impossible. And I think what Heidegger was, and a lot of and Wittgenstein and other people are doing, is they're trying to get us out of that notion of knowing that binds us that way to that representational, because all you get is skepticism and solipsism. And this is why that contact epistemology is coming back so prominent.
Just to quickly reference Nietzsche, I mean, one reading of Nietzsche would be to kind of critique this kind of view of life, of it being a task of spiritual progression. I mean, how do you answer that?
The problem with talking about Nietzsche is he's famously multivocal and he undermines himself and criticizes himself. But I think Nietzsche is trying to do something very analogous. He is trying to find within a naturalistic framework an ontology, the will to power, and an account of within that how transcendence is possible. And that is the proposal of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is a way in which human beings can plug into a naturalistic, lovers of the earth, a naturalistic metaphysics that nevertheless affords strong transcendence.
Wonderful. Thank you.